Wonderful to see the turnout for today's event. We see familiar faces and many new people joining us today. Our virtual programs are among the many ways our Federation is reaching out to bring our community together, as we also work to meet critical needs for our people. We are and will remain the community funder, planner, and convener. A huge thank you to Dr. Eli Sperling for joining us today. Who would have thought when we first started our virtual programs last March, we would still be going strong with them in the new year? The past 10 months have not been easy for anyone. As a loyal and committed donor to the annual campaign of the Jewish Federation of South Palm Beach County, I could not be more proud of our community and our Federation. Through the good times and the difficult times, our Federation is there to respond on a moment's notice. Our 2021 campaign began on September 1, and our community members in need are counting on us now more than ever. Through the annual campaign, our Federation raises and allocates funds to its partner agencies to provide critical assistance to those in need. And here are just some of the ways your gifts help our Jewish family near and far face unprecedented challenges during COVID-19. We keep our frail elderly unable to safely go out, secure and comforted with full nutritious meals at home. We are a lifeline for families facing income loss and overwhelming stress with emergency financial help and mental health services. We bring new immigrants from around the world to safety from anti-Semitism, destitution, broken infrastructures, and the pandemic to a new life in Israel. We bring virtual joy, creativity, and learning to children and adults with developmental disabilities during long days in their homes. Although today is not a fundraising event, we invite you to make a gift today of any size, as it will be greatly appreciated. Together, we will thrive through these challenging times and build a more resilient future. Make your gift today by visiting jewishboca.org/make-a-pledge. Before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping notes. Your microphone is muted for the presentation. In addition, you can adjust the way your screen appears. If you would like to view the person who is speaking, please select Speaker View at the top of the Zoom screen. If there's time at the end of the presentation, we will have a Q&A using the chat feature. And now allow me to introduce our speaker. Dr. Eli Sperling received an MA in Contemporary Middle Eastern History at Tel Aviv University. He has traveled and conducted research extensively throughout the Middle East, spending time in Israel, Cairo, and the Sinai Peninsula. He received his PhD in history from Ben Gurion University of the Negev. Currently, Eli is a postdoctoral associate in the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies and Center for Jewish Studies at Duke University, where he teaches undergraduate courses about modern Israel and Zionist history and conducts research on modern Hebrew music and Israeli national culture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sperling.
Thank you so much, Robin, and thank you so much to everyone for having me. Let me just get my screen share set up here. Okay, so there's a lot going on in politics in America. There's a lot going on in politics in the world. And one of the diamonds in the rough throughout this very tumultuous period of political life internationally, we have had this unexpected series of diplomatic events take place in the Middle East, contrary to many of the frameworks that people associate with what a peace deal looks like between Israel and an Arab state. To give a brief overview to put some historical context behind what we've been seeing in the past months, it's important to just state that Israel has had obviously a very complicated relationship with different states in the Middle East, her neighbors. However, these relationships have evolved over time. And as we've seen regional political foci shift, and we've seen the United States take varying actions to intervene in conflicts and in diplomatic processes in the region, it's often the case that Israel over the past 4 decades has grown closer to many moderate Sunni political entities within the Middle East. And in recent years, we've seen this grow even more. Now, contrary to what we may think about today in terms of Israel and Iran, up until the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Iran was actually Israel's greatest ally in the region. However, in 1979, during the Islamic Revolution, that relationship fell apart. And that same year, Israel brokered a deal in part with the help of the Carter administration and the United States government, and achieved its first official peace agreement with an Arab state. Today, Israel holds a peace agreement with Egypt from 1979, with Jordan from 1994, which came about during the period of the Oslo Accords. And now we have this growing list of Arab states that are joining on to the Abraham Accords and are historically normalizing relationships with Israel. Now, part of this is a strategic alignment where Middle Eastern countries see Israel and, in certain respects, the United States as being an important strategic ally in fighting Iranian adventurism, in tamping down Iran's military proxies in countries like Lebanon and Syria. But we also have a great wealth of Israeli technology that has been developed over Israel's history that is of incredible value to these Middle Eastern states that are signing on to the Abraham Accords. And uniquely, whereas in the past, Israel had to either or both give up lands that it took in 1967 to achieve a peace agreement or make a major concession to the Palestinians. And currently in this particular diplomatic process we see unfolding, it has not been the case that Israel has agreed to return any territory. And aside from Netanyahu's agreement to not annex the West Bank before signing the Abraham Accords, there's been no major concessions to the Palestinians, which shows that this process may indeed be marking a new evolution in Israel's place in the Middle East. Now, as a cultural historian who focuses on music, I have a bias towards music and pop culture's ability to shed some insights and some additional layers of context into what may be happening in politics. And the broader question that we see in the field when addressing the Abraham Accords and these unique new agreements between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Bahrain, and Sudan is these calls for a quote unquote warm peace. Now, it's the case that Israel's peace with Egypt and Jordan, while they've been upheld for decades since they were penned, are largely considered a cold peace, meaning that the populations of Israel and Jordan and Israel and Egypt don't interact that often. We have some examples of tourist sites in Jordan, like Petra, tourist sites in Egypt, like the Sinai Peninsula, where Egyptians and Israelis will meet, but typically in relatively transactional ways where it is a patron-client relationship. However, as part of the Abraham Accords, we've seen active pursuit of a warm peace, meaning a peace where the populations actually interact with each other. And pop music has been one of the unique ways that we've seen even artists in Israel and countries like the UAE make their own calls for a warm peace and a joining of these countries, not just in strategic interest, but in cultural similarity.
يا سلام يا بابا يا سلام يا ماما يا سلام يا سلام كل ولاد العالم
يا سلام يا أبا يا سلام يا إيمة يا سلام كل يلدينا. You hear me friend far away you hear my prayer.
I hear you pray far away I hear you pray. أهلا بك سلام ومرحبا
أهلا بك تودع مغوخبا أهلا بك متى
يا سلام صديقي يا سلام يا صاحبي
يا سلام يا سلام ما شلون خيب بنادم
يا سلام
So we'll pause this here. I'd love to watch the rest of the video, but since we have such a short amount of time to cover so much, I'll cut videos off relatively quickly. But we see a lot of very important elements of this video. First of all, that we have the hook, the chorus that is in English. And when this Mizrahi Moroccan Israeli singer and Emirati pop star, in the midst of the Abraham Accords, decided to write this song in Hebrew and Arabic, there was an understanding that there needed to be an English component to it because most Jewish Israelis don't speak Arabic. Most Emiratis certainly don't speak Hebrew. And while Hebrew and Arabic have many similar roots, and we can hear that in the musical style, this is a Middle Eastern musical style that is native to the Emirates and Israel. However, English is needed to create this common language where these two pop stars are talking about welcoming each other and the other country to their country and wanting to build upon commonality to define their relationship moving forward, leaving behind years of Middle Eastern states focusing on their differences and tensions with Israel. Now, one thing that I think is extremely important to highlight here is that it shouldn't be a surprise that an Israeli pop star would make a video with an Emirati pop star, and Middle Eastern style pop music is incredibly important in Israel, which for all intents and purposes is becoming more and more of a Middle Eastern state. And in part, this has to do with the fact that half of Israel's Jewish population come from Arab countries. Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews, which are actually a little more than half of Israel's Jewish population, at one point, before coming to Israel in the 1950s and 60s, those families spoke Arabic. And significant to this particular music video, they were part of Middle Eastern culture, Middle Eastern musical culture, and developed a cultural reality as a Jewish minority religion in the Middle East that was very much a part of the Arab world. And so seeing an effort to capitalize on that cultural commonality as a means to build diplomatic bridges is something very unique to this process and may in fact show that this could indeed be a warm peace that isn't just about strategic partnerships, but may create cultural bridges. Now, when we think about what is catalyzing this historic development where these calls for warm peace are occurring and peace agreements are being signed, and the Palestinians are not really a leverage point for the Middle Eastern parties. They're interested in something else. Now, a lot of this has to do with Israeli technology. And for years, water management has been one of Israel's greatest assets and something that Middle Eastern countries, being in an arid region, being in an area without very much fresh water, are very interested in. And it's actually the case that Israel and Jordan for years have been working together, utilizing Israeli water technologies as a part of their diplomatic connection. So I'll stop this here, but we see that Israel's ability to innovate and create technologies such as desalination plants, and to be able to develop research centers and teams of scientists that are able to execute projects like this, it's something that their neighbors in the region that don't have such research infrastructure and don't have such technological capabilities, they don't just want it, they need it. And now more than ever, as NASA reports that the Middle East is facing what they deem to be the worst drought in 900 years, it's not a surprise that Israel, as it's been leveraging its water technology with its diplomatic relationship with Jordan, and now even creating surpluses of water that they're selling to other countries in the region, that the UAE, that Bahrain, that other countries on salt water, but without fresh water, would desperately want access to the types of technology that Israel is not only creating, but is selling internationally. And so we see that a great component of these agreements goes beyond just strategic relationships or even cultural relationships. There's a sense of sharing technologies, not just for economic growth, but to allow an opportunity for countries like the UAE and Bahrain and others to have desalination plants, to take advantage of Israeli innovations in agriculture to do what Israel has done in the Negev desert, in desert regions of the Middle East that have never had access to this technology and now need it more than ever. Now, strategic relationships are also extremely important, and the tech ties, the innovation agreements, the scientific exchanges, the economic cooperation agreements, all do fit into a greater context of strategic shared interests. And the Middle East, in addition to being an area with very little fresh water, is an area that is unfortunately marred by war. And for these states that we see coming to Israel and working with the United States, we'll see shortly, but on a map, you see they're sitting right next to Iran. Now, Morocco and Sudan is a different story, but the UAE and Bahrain that really spearheaded the beginning of this process likewise have a concern in fighting Iranian regional adventurism and securing weapons necessary to have some sort of qualitative military edge over Iran, which sits just astride the Gulf from these two states. And we've seen that American-made F-35 jets, other technologies based in the defense industry have likewise been an extremely important component of these deals, helping us further understand why the Palestinian question was not important enough to these states to stand as a barrier to them coming to Israel and attaining all of these things that they've likely wanted for decades, but have not felt that they had the opportunity to publicly pursue. Now, just to give some of the history of this, to show that these evolutions come from years and years of Israel innovating and overcoming challenges within their land to be able to survive. And this is another stage of really, in a sense, reaping the fruits of those innovations. And water, something that no matter who you are, you need. And particularly in Israel in the 1940s, as they are seeing the British start to think about leaving, the possibility of the United Nations voting for a partition agreement, those Jews in the Jewish Yishuv in Palestine started constructing water pipelines to be able to manage water flow, understanding how important that would be in terms of any strategic, militaristic, or just national interests. And in 1946, we see the construction of the first pipeline bringing water from freshwater sources in the north of then Palestine, now Israel, to Jerusalem. And by the time we get to the 1950s and the first decade of statehood, Israelis also start recognizing that beyond just figuring out how to manage the flow of water, that they probably needed to figure out how to create new water sources. And most people don't realize this, but desalination plants started in Israel in the 1950s. And by 1964, Eilat, in fact, had its first desalination plant that, not with the same efficiency as the plants that Israel has today, was able to pull the salt from the water and create drinkable water. And this is a technology that has been refined over and over again over the decades, now to a point where we see Israel exporting this technology, building major plants in areas like San Diego, where the Poseidon desalination plant has been built recently. Likewise, in their agricultural pursuits. Now, agriculture and agricultural innovation was central to the Zionist ethos, even upon the early stages of Jewish immigration to the Yishuv in the late 19th century. And by 1965, with an emerging agricultural industry, there was an opening for agricultural technology to not only allow for Israelis to more efficiently grow crops, but to export that. An Israeli company, Netafim, in 1965 developed a technology, very simple, but known as drip irrigation, that had these easily adjustable pipes that would just drip enough water to each individual plant through a single hole to have it receive the water it needed while not wasting water with the evaporation so closely associated with trying to grow crops in this extremely arid climate. And again, over the decades, this technology was refined, it was tested locally, and it was sold internationally. And up until the 2000s, water was one of the greatest issues that Israel saw as a threat to its security, to its national security. But with advancements in desalination, today Israel has a surplus of water. We have 5 coastal desalination plants that produce over 50% of fresh water that Israelis consume. And in this situation for Arab states where we have this historic drought, we have growing populations, struggling economies, attaining the technology to be able to have sustainable freshwater sources and the ability to grow domestic crops in and of itself is of extreme strategic value. And as a result, we see commissions being established for scientific and technological exchanges. We see language in the Abraham Accords specifically talking about these types of exchanges and bringing Israeli scientists to areas like Dubai to help build out tech companies that are there that don't have talent. And this could open major opportunities for Israelis to find new job opportunities in the region, possibly for Emiratis or Bahrainis or Moroccans to come study in Israel, to take part in the Israeli economy, or for Israelis to go help build out the economies and tech sectors of those countries. Now, I want to look at defense and think about the F-35 deal and the controversies surrounding the United States deciding to sell this extremely advanced piece of military hardware that was wildly over budget, very secret, very sensitive, and something that the Israelis didn't really want the Emiratis to have.
3 different agreements in the space of just over 2 months. The Trump administration has clearly been successful when it comes to negotiating normalization and peace between Israel and Muslim countries. As Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu put it, the equation was no longer land for peace, but something else new and fresh.
A real peace, not just a slogan. Peace out of strength, peace for peace. A groundbreaking term, peace for peace.
2.5 months after that statement, it is now clear there is a price for peace, and it's quite heavy. By now, Israel has officially agreed to a deal involving the sale of F-35 fighter jets to the United Arab Emirates. Washington is committed by law to preserve Israel's military superiority, the qualitative military edge, or QME, but if Israel does not oppose the selling of highly sophisticated weapon systems to its neighbors, the U.S. can push forward with it.
We've had an incredible relationship.
So I'll stop here. When we talk about qualitative military edge, the Israelis being nervous about having other Arab states, particularly with these very fresh agreements that the future of them is still uncertain, it makes sense that the Israelis would want to maintain that qualitative military edge, but there is a history to this as well, and we've seen this exact issue relating to the sale of advanced American military aircraft to Israelis and other Arab states before. And likewise, similar to what we saw with water and agricultural technologies, Israel has a history of innovation that has placed them as a unique and, I would say, invaluable entity strategically in terms of military capabilities, both intelligence and in terms of developing military technologies and capabilities. And this has been the case, again, much like water, since before the state was even created. And in the pre-state period under British control, Jews in the Yishuv in Palestine had to create their own arms. And this evolved into the post-1948 period as actually quite a robust defense industry. Israel, likewise, during the 1950s, negotiated with France to attain the technology necessary to build a nuclear arms facility. And while negotiating with Charles de Gaulle, Ben-Gurion likewise went to America, met with Kennedy, who really did not want the Israelis to have a nuclear weapon. But in the negotiations, in a manner that was very typical of Ben-Gurion, he was very quiet about Israel's nuclear ambitions, gladly took the Hawk missiles that the Kennedy administration offered them as a carrot to not develop a nuclear program, and all the while finished the program having a what is thought to be robust nuclear arsenal, although Israel still does not talk about it. And similarly, throughout the years, Israel started developing its own weapon systems. The Merkava tank project, launched in the 1970s, is still in service. These tanks are still used by the Israeli military, and they're sold internationally. Likewise, in the early 1970s, Israel built the Kfir jet, at the time considered to be one of the more advanced fighter craft in the world. But by the time we get to the late 1970s, as part of the negotiating process between Israel and Egypt after the 1973 war, we see Carter in the late 1970s start talking about, in the context of building a peace deal between Egypt and Israel, and likewise looking at the United States Cold War interests and wanting to have allies that are armed in the region to fight against Soviet presence there. Carter wanted to give Egypt and Saudi Arabia, in addition to Israel, F-15 and F-16 fighter jets. Now, he was not able to get the deal done in his time in office. However, Reagan, in the first years of his administration, slammed the deal through. And in fact, added onto it, giving the Saudis AWAC jets, which are the most advanced of American intelligence gathering planes. Now, the Israelis were incensed, again, making the exact same argument we see today about this challenging their qualitative military edge in the region. But the justification from the American administration was that these states would not receive particular pieces of offensive hardware to put on the fighter jets. They wouldn't receive the fancy bells and whistles that Israel got. And that was the carrot given to Israel to even begrudgingly accept that that was the new reality, that other states in the Middle East would have advanced fighter jets that weren't the Russian MiGs associated with Arab armies. Now, today, Israel has become so advanced in their aerospace technologies, they've long scrapped having the Kfir jet be the focus of their technology. And since they started receiving F-15s and F-16s in the 70s and 80s, began reverse engineering those jets, often selling that technology back to the United States. And in fact, is the only country in the world that is allowed to reverse engineer the new F-35s. They're also the only country in the world the United States is allowing to service them themselves. And part of this has to do with Israel being able to maintain its qualitative military edge, where it can modify the jets to be more capable, more powerful, more efficient than the same model held by other armies in the region. But likewise, the Americans see an interest in having the Israelis tinker with their very expensive design and improve on it. And in addition to the technology behind military hardware that states engaged in the Abraham Accords are starting to get, Israel has advanced a defense tech that has gone so far beyond what other players in the region have that, again, we see countries like the UAE and Bahrain not caring about any stigmas associated with negotiating with Israel, not involving the Palestinians, if they have access to these types of technologies. Unit 8200 in the IDF is a unit that is dedicated to cyber warfare. They have developed technologies such as the Stuxnet virus, which in 2011 was put onto a thumb drive, inserted into a computer in an Iranian nuclear facility, and was able to, under the radar, with a computer program, without the detection of the Iranian techs in that facility, to speed up the centrifuges that enriched the uranium to a speed that was so fast that the facility literally broke from the inside before the Iranians even knew what was happening. And this was a decade ago. And considering the Iranian moves towards achieving a nuclear weapon, Iranian proxies fighting against states in the region, including attacking Saudi oil fields, we can see that these countries want this defense tech. They want the protection of Israel. They want agricultural technology. They want cultural ties even. They want to be able to take advantage of these entities that already exist in the region without having to go through the traditional diplomatic dance that involved so many processes surrounding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And we see that no longer being the case. And for Morocco, we see a very unique evolution in the warm peace that is starting to develop. Now, some may know this, but the second largest ethnic group in Israel are actually Moroccans. And over the years, in the past decade, we've seen a lot more connections developing between Moroccan Jews in Israel and many different Moroccan communities of different religions in Morocco. We've seen musicians coming from Israel to perform with Moroccan and other North African ensembles. And recently, as part of these developments and this push towards a warm peace to further foster these connections between all of these states, the first Hebrew-Israeli novel has been translated to Arabic for the Moroccan market. And it's in fact a story written by a Moroccan-Israeli writer and scholar, Gabriel Ben Shimon. And it's about an Israeli girl falling in love with a Holocaust survivor against the backdrop of the early years of the state of Israel and the influx of Moroccan and other Mizrahi immigrants, showing that we also see an interest amongst Moroccans in learning about Israeli history and understanding what happened with the Jewish population once they left Morocco and showed up to Israel. Now, Sudan is a little bit more complicated of a story. In recent days, even, we've seen protests erupting in Khartoum against the government for looking towards a peace deal with the Israelis. But extremely significant to note is that Khartoum, where we see the center of the push for diplomacy with Israel right now, in 1967, just months after the conclusion of the Six-Day War, the Arab League met in Khartoum and came out with the famous resolution of 3 no's, where they would not negotiate with Israel, they would not recognize Israel, and they would not concede to Israel. And now, as a result of all of these developments, a country like Sudan, which had such a history of staunch and militant opposition to Israel, is opening up despite this domestic pushback. Now, Saudi Arabia is a different and complicated story. They have not signed on to the Abraham Accords, although some are arguing, even Netanyahu, that a normalization agreement could be coming as soon as maybe even in the next year. But Saudi Arabia has long held ties with Israel. And as we saw, Saudi Arabia received advanced military hardware from the United States in the early 1980s. And immediately after receiving those jets, in fact, 2 months after, Saudi Arabia released the Fahd Plan, which was the first Saudi-proposed comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace offering, amended again in the early 2000s in the form of the Arab Peace Initiative, or the API. And so Saudi Arabia, while they maintain a unique place in the Middle East as being the monarchy that presides over Islam's most holy sites, they're more conservative in their foreign policy in terms of public approaches, but we know that they have quietly been working with the United States and at times with Israel for decades at this point regarding strategic interests in the region. Now, they've opened up airspace for commercial flights between Israel and the Emirates, and this could signal that maybe the Saudis would be willing to open up to an actual formal diplomatic agreement with Israel. Although we don't know, and this remains to be seen. And part of this will relate to what happens with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Now, I just want to very quickly note that as a result of all these factors we've looked at, we see that these developments are not new. It's not that America came in and catalyzed this diplomatic process out of nowhere. America came in as a guarantor of these deals, as a provider of weapons of strategic value. But these are interests that Arab states and Israel have had for a long time. And as a result of that, I don't think that a change of administration in the United States, or even in the upcoming elections that we'll have in Israel in March, where Netanyahu may form another government or may be finally pushed out of his seat as the longest sitting prime minister of Israel, that the new government in Israel too will find the same strategic value in upholding these particular interests. Now, I just want to make a quick note about how really monumental the situation is with regard to the Palestinian question being left out on the one hand. But on the other hand, even the reaction of the Saudis that have not agreed to making a diplomatic deal with Israel, but have come out very publicly making their grievances against the Palestinians and their lack of coming to the negotiating table quite public. And I'm going to show a brief clip from an interview that former ambassador to the United States, Saudi Prince Bandar, gave very recently in October, talking about this tension that he sees with the Palestinians and why he feels that Israel should have been able to go forward with diplomatic agreements, regardless of including the Palestinian question.
عقب ما قريت اللي حكينا فيه البارح كله وكتبته قلت تدري نمشي وتجي على الطبيعة. سبب رغبتي اني اتحدث الليلة اني سمعت في الايام الاخيرة كلام منقول عن الأخوة في القيادة الفلسطينية، ولأن الكلام اللي سمعته ما توقعته بالتأكيد منهم ولا صدقته حتى، وبعدها بيوم أو يومين شفته الصوت وصور على التلفزيون.
تعلن القيادة الفلسطينية رفضها واستنكارها الشديدين للإعلان الثلاثي الأمريكي الإسرائيلي الإماراتي المفاجئ.
تنكروا لكل شيء، لحقوق الشعب الفلسطيني، للدولة الفلسطينية، لرؤية الدولتين، للقدس الشريف التي ضمت وأعلن ضمها. تنكروا إلى كل هذا وقالوا نحن جئنا لكم بالضم فافرحوا أيها الفلسطينيون.
طعنة مسمومة في ظهر الشعب الفلسطيني ومحاولة للالتفاف على الشرعية الدولية.
اللي سمعته من القيادات الفلسطينية في الأيام الأخيرة الحقيقة مؤلم، والسبب أنه مؤلم لأنه كان مستواه واطي، وكلام لا يقال من قبل مسؤولين عن قضية يبغون الناس كلهم يوقفون معهم فيها، وتجرأهم بالكلام الهجين ضد قيادات الخليج ودول الخليج مو بغير مقبول فقط، مرفوض. لكن إذا فكرت فيها من ناحية ثانية ما هو غريب استخدام كلمة سهولة، أنه يسهل عليهم استخدام كلمة خان والطعن في الظهر، لأن هذه سنتهم في التعامل مع بعضهم. اللي يحكمون في غزة الانفصاليين عن السلطة يتهمون القيادات في الضفة أنهم خونة، والناس القيادات اللي في الضفة تتهم القيادات المنفصلة في غزة أنهم طعنونا في الظهر.
So I'm going to stop this here. I recommend everyone Google this interview. Just Google Prince Bandar interview Al Arabiya. It's a 3-part series to see the former Saudi ambassador to the United States on Arab media, on Al Arabiya, make these rebukes against the Palestinian Authority and Hamas in the context of supporting Israel and diplomatic dealings with other countries in the region is remarkable. To those of us in the field, to people casually reading the news, this entire process has been, in a sense, bewildering, but is exciting. It is something that I think is one of the few things that we can really feel truly positive about in terms of politics in the world right now. And the fact that some of the rancor is being pulled out of the Middle East and allowing Israel to, in a sense, continue to evolve to become a Middle Eastern state. And I will end by noting that really the most powerful countries in the Middle East are not Arab and don't speak Arabic: Israel, Turkey, and Iran. And Israel is now, at least from what we can see, moving towards occupying a new place as a leader in the region. And with that, I will end, and I would love to field some questions.
Okay, so that was very interesting. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please use the chat feature. And actually, I have one here for Dr. Sperling. Let's see. How has your relationship and involvement in your parents' Jewish activism influenced your philosophy and thesis?
Whew, well, that's a great question. My father is a rabbi and my mother is a musician. And so I guess in a very simple sense, the fact that I'm a cultural historian that looks at Israeli music is a direct reflection of my parents. But I think more significantly, I grew up in a house where critical thought was valued. And I think in looking at this situation, and my thesis of this talk really being that this process is a long time coming, and in many ways it's natural, comes from this critical view of what Israel is, understanding its population, and that half of its Jews are of Middle Eastern descent, 20% of its population are Arab, some even identifying with the Palestinian national movement. And as a result of that, Israel is a dominantly Middle Eastern country. And it makes sense that they would be evolving towards this new diplomatic place. And so I guess my musical and historical analyses probably come from some influence of my parents, but I would say that critical thought is one of the most important things in really looking at any political circumstance or historic circumstance, but this one in particular, because so many of these things can be counterintuitive or cut against the grain of what we hear in the media. We don't often hear in the media people talking about Moroccan musicians collaborating with Israeli Moroccan musicians to recreate liturgical music from the 16th century. We don't often hear about Hebrew books being translated into Arabic. We don't hear about Moshe Herzberg, the professor from Ben Gurion University working with Palestinians on water conservation. And so sometimes we need to think critically and peer a little bit behind the curtain or peel back some of the layers of the onion to get a full picture of what's going on.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Sperling, for taking the time to be with us today and for sharing your knowledge about the Abraham Accords. And thanks to everybody who joined us. Let's see, please look for some information about the February 16th Robert Watson Fed Live program, which will discuss Truman and the creation of the State of Israel. Look for your email with additional meaningful ways to connect with our Federation and our Jewish community during these unprecedented times, including how to make a real difference for those who need us by contributing to our annual campaign. Together with our caring community, we thrive. Stay safe and be well.